Thanks all. Also note, guys, I've just hit the record button on this presentation. Just has been people have requested to hear. You can't make it today. Have requested recording, so just to let you know that this meeting is being recorded. If you flick on to the next slide, please, Claire. Just go through the purpose of the event here today. So, first purpose is to summarise the FESS project background, the scope and the objectives. Secondly, as Cormac referenced there, provide an update on the FLEX project. So throughout the FESS project, we've highlighted the relationship and the coordination of the FESS project to the FLEX project. So we thought it'd be a worthwhile exercise for Cormac to come along and talk us through the FLEX project and its achievements to date. Then summarise the key activities that have taken place throughout the project. So a review of the activities over the 18 months that the project has been active. And then finally outline how certain FESS activities will be further progressed. So to highlight really how FESS has delivered within the 18 months, but also then its work streams that, while initiated by the FESS team and by the project, will continue to be progressed by other relevant departments within NIE. A few housekeeping rules, I suppose. I see if most people here on mute, if it'd be just to help the flow of the event, it'd be good if everybody can stay on mute. We are hosting a Q&A at the end. So throughout the presentation, if you want to fire messages or questions into the chat function, then we can tackle them all at the end of the presentation. Next slide, please, Claire. Quick run through the agenda then. So after a few opening remarks, we're going to go through the FESS project background. I'll then hand over to Cormac to talk through FLEX for around 15 minutes. Claire's then going to come in and talk us through the project activities of the FESS project, all the way from the initial technology assessment then to the solutions being progressed to the barriers that were identified. We'll then look at next steps, not just for the FESS project, but for the work identified within the FESS project and how it will be taken forward. And then, as I say, we open up for a discussion and a Q&A at the end. Next slide, please, Claire. I'm just going to invite Andrew Couples, Future Networks Manager, to come and to present on this slide, please.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. I suppose just an introduction, like the FESS project is part of our wider innovation portfolio here at NIE Networks, and some of you will be aware of some of the other projects that are identified on the screen there at the minute. We got an allowance from our regulator for the current regulatory period of around £6 million to invest in innovation projects, and ultimately the idea of those is, of all of these projects, is that as we see more renewable generation coming onto the distribution network, and also what we would call low carbon technologies in terms of batteries, solar panels, electric vehicle chargers, all those kind of things, we're likely to get more and more constraints on the network, both in terms of demand and generation across the network. And traditionally, to address those, what we would have had to have done would be to invest in new circuits, new substations, bigger transformers, all that kind of thing, and basically a range of different capital investment solutions, which some of which could be expensive and could be dealing with potentially a short period of overload, maybe during a winter peak or something like that there. So what we're exploring really for the first time during this regulatory period is how we can do more smart or flexible solutions to deal with those constraints and to manage those constraints. And the idea would be that we could deploy these and they would be at a lesser cost than a conventional reinforcement solution, and so that ultimately the wider customer base that we serve would save money on their electricity bill out the other end of this. Look, FESS and FLEX are going to be covered off in more detail today. I'll maybe just touch on a couple of the other projects. A couple of them, DRVC is demand reduction through voltage control, and that project and also the StatCom project are focusing on how we can better manage the voltage on our networks and keep that within statutory limits, even with a wider range of technologies being deployed on the network. the SAM project is looking at a couple of different methods of how we can enhance the thermal ratings of our assets. A lot of our overhead lines and transformers would have a fixed rating, and that there's a lot of assumptions built into that. But perhaps on a cool day or a windy day, we could get more out of those assets under certain circumstances, and by managing that in a smarter manner. Yeah, the final one there, low voltage active network management. We're deploying smart circuit breakers and smart switches on our low voltage network. And ultimately, this is where the vast majority of domestic customers are going to be connecting their low carbon technologies onto our low voltage network. So we're looking at smarter ways there of how we manage constraints, both thermal constraints and voltage constraints, to cope with the increased demands on that network. So we're running a range of different trials, and the vast majority of those are in progress at the minute. Our intention would be to take the learnings from those, and where those are successful, to deploy those in the kind of business as usual operation. So that going forward, if we identify a constraint at a substation or on a cable network, that we would have the option of deploying a kind of conventional solution or a smart solution or a market-based solution, and that we would weigh up what is the best value for all our customers. We would deploy that solution, and then ultimately that would enable the decarbonisation of the energy sector, which is the ultimate goal of all of these. So that's a very quick summary of those projects. Look, there is more information on our website on all those projects, and look, happy to be in touch with people around specifics of any of those. So yeah, I'll hand back to Josh now at this stage.
Great, Andrew. Thanks very much for that. Yeah, so I suppose that's provided a bit of context from a NIE Networks perspective on FESS and where it sits among our suite of innovation projects. But I want to put the slide up as well, just to provide a bit of wider context. And for any of you who've been involved in previous engagements with ourselves and FESS, you may recognise the slide and the content of it. But I want to highlight a couple of key quotes from the energy strategy consultation, which was issued by the DFE in March 21. The first one, we proposed to set a renewable electricity target of 70% by 2030, with the option of increasing this to 80%. I suppose what I want to highlight then is among the 5 criteria, you will see that storage technologies can minimize system curtailment of renewables, recognizing the importance and the vital nature of storage as we move forward for the future energy system. There's also a quote at the bottom there where the DFE stated, "We believe that having a power system based around flexibility is key to achieving a decarbonised energy system at the lowest cost to consumers whilst maintaining security of supply." And whilst it's worth saying that flexibility or storage isn't the only provider of flexibility, because of its unique nature, it is well placed to provide this flexibility to the power system. Next slide, please, Claire. Project background of the FESS project. So as Andrew's alluded to, we're all aware of the increasing levels of renewable generation, of growing demand, and the increased penetration of LCTs, which is only ever going to increase in recent years. It's then a natural extension of that it's managing network constraints is becoming increasingly challenging on the distribution network. And again, as Andrew's alluded to, while in many cases, or in some cases, conventional reinforcement will be required, we are running these innovation projects to seek smart and market-based, cost-efficient alternatives where they prove cost-effective for the Northern Ireland customer. But ultimately, FESS will seek to advance the mutual benefits electricity storage can provide to both customers and to the network. Doing this by enhancing the ability of the network to accept energy storage to help meet net zero targets. Doing this by ensuring that it's appropriately supported and its integration to the distribution system is considered. And we'll talk about this in detail later on, but the key thing with that is doing this through identifying barriers and then identifying subsequent solutions to them barriers. Next slide, please, Claire. Again, this will be talked through in great detail later on, but just to give an overview at this stage of the project scope which we set out with. Start off with a technology assessment where we looked at took an holistic approach to storage, other projects of similar nature that have taken place in GB and further afield, and also how storage is treated in other jurisdictions. Then went out to a market evaluation where we assessed the appetite for storage in Northern Ireland, and also got a very useful view of how stakeholders view any barriers which may exist. Then there was 2 separate activities where we looked at network constraints and then developed potential use cases for storage. And then through a collection of sources, between both external and internal, we identified the barriers to deployment of storage and then developed and implemented potential solutions. As many of you would have seen, and I know some on this call even responded to the consultation which we issued at the beginning of summer of this year. We put together a consultation document and consulted on the FESS program of work, and also asked a number of targeted questions to get specific feedback on issues. And then the stage we're at now is project dissemination events and close down report. Next slide, please, Claire. Just to highlight at this early stage, I suppose, the original FESS objectives which we worked towards. We had a separate activity or standalone activity looking at potential use cases for storage in Northern Ireland, which was near the beginning of the project. We then identified barriers to storage deployment. And as I say, this took out both an internal and an external view. Then developed solutions to these identified barriers to storage deployment, which has been completed in many cases, and in some cases it's ongoing, as we'll talk about in the remaining slides. And similarly then with preparing storage requirements and specifications, a lot of good work's been done in the FESS project, and some of it will be progressed by other relevant departments. Similarly, another standalone activity was identification of the constraints on the distribution network that can be assisted by storage. And as I say, the consultation which went out in the beginning of summer of this year. The final objective then was developing methods for NIE Networks to signal to the market where storage would be of greatest value. And you see against that we have the name of the FLEX project. And so it's at this point that I just want to hand over to Cormac to come and to talk about the FLEX project in a bit more detail and about what it's achieved over recent months.
Thanks, Josh. So Claire, if we could move to this slide. So first of all, a brief introduction to flexibility, and really I like to think it's quite a simple concept. It's defined in GB generally as a customer's ability to modify or change their generation or consumption in reaction to an external signal. Now that could be a price signal or indeed a direct dispatch instruction from a system operator. Typically, we experience, we have a daily profile and we have peaks, particularly coming into this time of year, we have our winter peaks. And as Andrew mentioned there earlier on, we would normally build out our network. This might mean adding a substantial chunk of capacity onto the network for what may be a very small or infrequent overload. Now, through using flexibility, we plan to address the cause of congestion rather than simply implementing a copper solution. So in that way, we hope to engage customers to manage their demand, and really in this example, to reduce their demand at those peak times, therefore dragging the demand within existing network capacity. This allows us obviously to remain within our license and statutory obligations, but overall allowing asset utilization to increase. If we move to the next slide. Really the two common questions are typically, why do we use flexibility? Well, first of all, it can be very cost effective. As I mentioned there, some of the solutions could be extremely expensive, replacing transformers and substations, building new overhead lines and underground cables. Whereas we would hope to engage customers for potentially a relatively low number of hours in a given year. And this could represent a substantial cost reduction in managing our network. We're also offering a revenue stream and within reason to be kept within local markets and communities. And we hope that this will support investment in flexible and ideally low carbon technologies. We also, obviously, this is a relatively low disruption technique, so that we're not effectively putting customers off supply whenever we're carrying out outages to reinforce the network. We're minimizing, or I suppose digging up roads and so on, that we would classify as a general societal disruption. And then finally, and potentially one of the most important parts of flexibility, is that inherent option value. By the fact that we're not deploying new assets on the network, that means that we are really minimizing the risk of having a stranded asset. We can simply delay investment decisions for a number of years to gather more information to confirm that trends continue to, I suppose, follow the path that we project. And then at a stage in the future with a greater bank of data, then we can make a much more informed investment decision. Then who can participate? Well, essentially anyone. The Clean Energy Package from the European Union specifically references distributed generation, demand response, energy storage, and energy efficiency. And this is both at an industrial and commercial and a domestic level. Now, we should reiterate that we are technology neutral. It's both in that European legislation and in our own license obligations, so we must not discriminate between any class or classes of customers. One of the key practical barriers we sometimes face is that customers must be connected within the correct geographic location, or really downstream from the point of congestion, which we'll touch on in the next slide. And then finally, obviously, customers must meet our minimum technical requirements. That is, being able to respond to signals in time, or instructions in time, being able to meet the minimum capacities that we set for efficiency purposes and so on. And we'll come to that again in a subsequent slide. Can we move on, Claire? So Flex project itself is a 1.2 million pounds innovation integration project, which we kicked off in April last year. Through a series of network studies and projections out to as far out as 2040, we identified 17 specific areas on the distribution network in which we would like to trial the use, or first of all, the procurement and then use of flexibility services. And you'll see them on the right-hand side. These zones covered approximately 15% of all customers in Northern Ireland, and represent various, obviously, urban and rural areas, and make up different compositions of domestic as well as industrial and commercial. We are looking for, whenever we went out to procurement, we sought flexibility services from where we now are is November of this year. So we have now begun our flexibility service period out to April next year in the main, and that's really to cover our typical winter peaks that we would experience. The program for the Flex project involved a very substantial sum of our program of stakeholder engagement, and that culminated in a launch event last February, which some of the audience may have been on. We went through a very detailed product development process, and again identifying our minimum requirements in the next page, but this was done really closely with the Energy Networks Association over based in GB, and this is very much to keep us aligned with the enormous volume of work that's been done over there, and the fact that markets and for flexibility services are much more mature in GB. One of our key objectives in developing our flexibility services is to make them stackable, and to that end we have effectively no exclusivity clauses in that, and this is really important because we want customers or energy storage operators to be able to stack revenues from the energy market, DS3, potentially capacity mechanisms, or anything else that they can avail of, obviously to make the best commercial offering to the providers, but also to hopefully place downward pressure on actually the cost of flexibility. We don't want to end up in a position where we're competing with all the revenue streams. And then finally, the procurement exercise, which is now complete, kicked off in April of 2021, earlier this year. It was done on a competitive basis, and it was structured as a pay-as-bid process. Could we go to the next slide, please? Through the process of product development, we identified 3 products: sustain, secure, and dynamic. And if you're familiar with them, you'll understand that these are very closely aligned with GB, and they reflect different use cases within congestion management. On the left-hand side, sustain is really our scheduled product, where services are really the delivery schedule is known at the point of procurement. With that, and obviously a concrete delivery schedule, we only have a utilization payment for the energy delivered. Secure in the middle is our pre-fault product, where we will dispatch based on forecast network congestion, and we will give 24 hours notice, and this is comprised of both availability and utilization. And then dynamic is commercially structured the same as a secure product, but this is our post-fault product, where we'll be dispatching with 3 minutes notice. So we really require a faster response to respond to a network event that has occurred. All of our procurement processes and really how we've designed the whole Flex project is underpinned by the principles at the bottom of the slide. So really visible and accessible opportunities, simple and streamlined processes, fair and neutral processes, and then obviously open and transparent outcomes, and that's both in the tendering and also with regards to dispatch. And again, like all things, aligning very closely with the outcomes and the principles from the Energy Networks Association. If we take the next slide, please. Yes, now for the results. So we tendered for 40 megawatts across our 17 zones, and we were successfully awarded contracts for 20 megawatts in 11 of those zones. The total value of all these contracts is in the region of £400,000. And this makes up, well, first of all, we're successful in procuring all 3 products, which is fantastic for the trial because it means that we can really have the widest possible scope of learning. This is made up of 22 individual contracts, which were awarded to 5 different operators of distributed, I suppose, assets, classes. Obviously on the right-hand side there, you can see the revenue ranges that were available. Now, that's not to say that these are the minimum or the maximum that we would pay, but that is what we observed coming through in tender and what we accepted. And the average price or the payment was £13,500 per megawatt per year. Could we move to the next slide? Really, well, look, we couldn't go through this without a graph, and we are now into our live trial where we are dispatching flexibility services, and this really marks a milestone in our transition from a distribution network owner to a distribution system operator, the DSO transition. And what you can see is HV data coming back from our network monitors on the system. And really, this is how we plan to use flexibility going forward, where we dispatch which in and around peak times. And in this example, you can see a really strong performance from a provider, delivering 1 megawatt of flexibility between 4 and 5. And obviously, you can see the underlying pattern of demand and noise really that comes with that. If we could move to the next slide. This is potentially very interesting for the audience, but this is a battery, or actually a group of quite small batteries providing flexibility services to the networks are really behind the meter. The red really shows the import and export from the battery. So what you can see on the left-hand side was this operator chose to charge up their batteries overnight, and then obviously dispatch them between 4 and 5 p.m. again. Now, in this particular product, this was the secure product where they had 24 hours notice, and then allowed them to plan ahead and really, well, optimize the battery how they saw fit. In the green profile there, you can see that actually the net import and export from the customer's premises onto the grid. And obviously you can see where the export from the battery has been in some between 4 and 5 p.m. is suppressing local demand, so we're not seeing the same level of spill onto the network as the export from the batteries. Look, we have a huge amount of this trial still to run. The service period kicked off on the 15th of November, and we're expecting it to go out to the 15th of April. And obviously we'll be dispatching a lot more now as when they run up to the winter peaks, and really then bulking out the data to understand the reliability that's associated with flexibility. Is there potentially different technology types or that perform better than others, and how then we can factor that into our future offerings. So we'll move to the final slide, I think, and we'll I'll wrap up. So as we look ahead, so as I mentioned, we have to complete our trial, we have to analyze the results and I suppose make recommendations. We are considering supplementary flexibility tenders to really implement our kind of early learnings. So we've had a huge amount of learnings from the initial feedback on our products and tender process, and then we want to try that again whilst we're in the I suppose under the Flex project umbrella, and also then continue to look at how we can further enable particularly domestic flexibility. And then finally transition this through to what we would term a business as usual solution, where it's no longer under the innovation umbrella. We want to see flexibility being a large part of our RP7 business plan. That's the period now that begins in April 2024 and will run out to probably 2029, the 5-year period when we invest in network and build it out. And we want to see flexibility now being used as an alternative to that conventional those conventional solutions. We're also beginning to consider what our further and future innovation will look like. And certainly as we look over to GB, we can see they're beginning to explore reactive power services and then also closer to real-time procurement, which is obviously very, very interesting for ourselves. And there may be services that energy storage providers may also want to participate in. So look, just to wrap up on the final slide, we encourage you to get involved in terms of the stakeholder engagement. You can email us at flexibility@nienetworks.co.uk to join or effectively subscribe to our mailing list. Through that, you'll get key project updates, reports, and then you'll also be made aware of any future flexibility opportunities. And then, of course, visit our website, www.nienetworks.co.uk/flexibility. So look, that's all from me. I'll hand over to Josh now to take us through the next session.
Great, Cormac. Thanks very much for taking the time to go through that. And while this is a FESS event, we thought it'd be very useful to have Cormac along to talk about Flex and in tandem, so to speak. You know, we referenced the mutual benefits that exist for both customers and the network of storage, and there is Flex is certainly an example of that. But onto all things FESS then, and I'm going to hand over to Claire to take us through the next few slides. Apologies, Claire. I think there's maybe something up with the audio. We can't quite hear you.
Is that better?
That's better now. Yeah.
Oh, good. Worrying moment. So yeah, thank you, Josh, and thank you, Cormac. And as Josh mentioned, now going to talk people through what we've been doing over the past 18 months on the FESS project. So 18 months we've been working on this, so do bear with us. It's been a challenge to condense it into half an hour, but we will do our best. So when talking about what we've been up to, I'm going to talk about it in two broad parts. Firstly, looking at from what we've done from the project inception up to the point of identifying barriers to storage. And then secondly, looking at how we've addressed some of those barriers and what will happen next. So way back in May last year, we started with an activity called a technology assessment. So this was really trying to get a lay of the land for all things storage. So we were looking at storage technologies and capabilities. And so, for example, the graph in the top right there was a bit of a summary of the different storage technologies and where they sit in terms of battery power ratings and discharge times. We also looked at deployment levels of storage globally, and the graph at the bottom right shows global and annual storage deployment from 2013 to 2018. So that just nicely illustrates just how much it's been taking off. And we also looked at regulatory and commercial environment for storage. So a whole piece of work behind this, but just some of the things to pull out. So we have actually been living with storage for decades with pumped hydro, but due to the geographic limitations associated with that technology, we've now got many more different technologies coming forwards. Grid services have traditionally been provided by synchronous generation, but we see that storage certainly has the capabilities to provide this support as well. Energy storage facilities have been the subject of a number of innovation projects, and there's been some really valuable learning from these projects. One thing that has already been touched on is the fact that storage is technically capable of providing different services at the same time, leading to something called revenue stacking. And Cormac has already touched on the need for non-exclusive contracts, and we'll come back to that as well in this talk. A lot of these new storage technologies are relatively new technologies for grid applications. So what we've seen from some of the example projects is that the regulatory framework can be a barrier to connecting storage. And in fact, there have been some really interesting learnings from GB on the regulatory framework for storage, particularly in issues to do with definitions in licenses and having to address some issues with double charging, specifically in GB for balancing charges. And finally, looking at the island context, the All Island DS3 programme has developed a market for transmission system services, which storage is allowed to compete in. So that's driven some of the large storage connections that have been seen so far in Ireland. So moving on then, our next activity was to conduct a market evaluation to try and gauge the appetite from stakeholders to participate to develop storage projects in Northern Ireland, specifically connecting at the distribution level. So we conducted a survey last summer and had 66 responses from a diverse set of organisations, which was very helpful. Some of the things we gleaned from the responses, the predominant connection configurations that people were either actively developing or planning or were considering developing were mainly focusing on grid connected storage or storage co-located with generation. And linked to that, the primary purpose envisaged for the storage facilities were related to either the provision of transmission services or increasing the utilisation of renewable generation. So those factors seem to be key drivers in the motivation for connecting storage in Northern Ireland. This piece of work was really helpful to start to get people's thoughts on barriers to storage in Northern Ireland. And from the responses, the areas, the themes that were considered to be a significant barrier by most respondents were around grid connection and grid codes and regulation. And the areas of least concern were around supply chain, finance, and technical requirements. So as mentioned, some themes on barriers to storage started to emerge, particularly from the free-form responses in the survey, and that's something that we'll come back to shortly. So going from the technology assessment, which was sort of more general about storage, we then started to focus on Northern Ireland and NIE Networks specifically in relation to storage. So in our next activity, we wanted to understand what are the network constraints that are currently faced by NIE Networks or that they're expecting to face in the coming years, and to start to think about how storage could support some of these. And this activity is linked very closely to our use case activity, which I'll talk about on the next slide. So we had some really good discussions with various people within NIE Networks, and the broad causes of network constraints that they were telling us about were around incremental load growth. So the cost to NIE Networks to reinforce parts of the network to ensure that they comply with their security of supply standards. There was also a piece around generation connections and understanding that there's limited capacity or no export capacity in certain geographic parts of the network where further generation can't be connected. And finally, there was an area around the growth in low carbon technologies and the impact that's having on distribution substations on NIE Networks system. So they've already started to see the impact of multiple domestic PV installations in a small geographic area, but are also forecasting an impact from an increase in electric vehicles and heat pumps. So from this activity, we developed a set of use cases, which I'll talk about on the next slide. And we also went through a process to assess the potential benefits of storage to support these constraints that we've talked about. So in some cases, using real substation data, which we've got a graph of on the left-hand side, a set of annual data to try and look at how a storage project, in theory, could respond to thresholds being exceeded, and starting to look at some of the economics of those examples. So as I mentioned, another activity which was closely linked to the network constraints was to identify a set of use cases. So ways in which scenarios and examples of which storage could support some of the constraints that we've been identifying. So what's really important to stress here is that these use cases are theoretical. They're ideas from the FESS project, and the processes to do these things don't exist yet. It links very strongly to what Cormac has been talking about with the FLEX project. So our use cases were broadly categorized into these two categories. On the left-hand side, we had various ways that storage could help to address constraints on the network. So for example, looking at distribution substation overload, which could be due to increased demand from electric vehicles and heat pumps, and just general network peak demand at peak time, which, as Cormac mentioned, that's typically your evening peak.
Make the cardboard boxes. They're all flat out. That been this last year and a half. World wants cardboard boxes.
Shall I'll just. Oh, thank you. I was just checking if that's a question, but I don't think it was. Yes, so we've got our distribution substation overloads due to typically low carbon technologies. The potential for storage to support group demand increases at your primary substation level, and also the potential to address voltage constraints. And then on the right-hand side, we had a set of use cases which were more focused on facilitating generation connections. So either looking at your large generation connections, your G99 connections, where storage could be used to manage generation export, where there's no capacity in the network at certain times for further export. One of the use cases was looking at G98 generation, so the smallest scale generation, typically domestic PV. And how storage could help to mitigate potential issues with reverse power flows from a large amount of dispersed generation. And finally, a use case looking at the potential for storage and other flexibility providers to be prioritized in a connection queue if they can unlock capacity for other connections. So then following that, we came on to our activity trying to understand, identify and categorize barriers to storage, specifically in Northern Ireland and with a focus on distribution network connections. So as I said, part of the FESS project was dedicated to identifying and categorizing these barriers. And the market survey that we conducted during last summer made a significant contribution to our understanding here. So that was extremely helpful. And we broadly categorized the barriers into these 4 themes: industry codes and regulation, information transparency, commercial arrangements, and grid connection process. And I'll go into these in a bit more detail shortly. So once we had our whole list of barriers, almost everything that we could think of had been told, and we needed to go through a process of that complete list to what the FESS project could sensibly do. So starting off with our identification of barriers, a significant contributor to that was the market survey. We also had follow-on calls with a number of respondents to the market survey, which was very helpful to understand some of the issues raised in a bit more detail. We also undertook an internal survey within NIE Networks to get the point of view of some of Josh's colleagues about what could they foresee barriers to processing storage connections being. And we drew on industry reports, notably the Energy Storage Island Roadmap, which was very helpful, and previous FESS deliverables, particularly the technology assessment. So we had this complete list of barriers, and we went through a bit of a sort of assessment process and a triage of them. So some of the barriers that we had identified really were not in the remit of NIE Networks. Typically, we ascribe those to the utility regulator, the Department for the Economy, or a group called the Flex Tech Industry Forum. So there was a group of issues that it really didn't make sense for NIE Networks to pursue. As we've also heard, there's some overlap and relationship between the FESS project and the Flex project. So some of the issues we picked up are being dealt with by the Flex project. And finally, there were also some things that could have been relevant, but actually there were already other teams within NIE Networks addressing those things. So we had a sort of funnel process to narrow down to what our potential FESS program of work was. So we've talked about this process of leading up to our list of barriers. There's much more detail on this in the FESS consultation paper, which is probably still available, but just wanted to touch on some of those here. So this is what you have been telling us are the challenges that you either face or foresee. So in terms of industry codes and regulation, concerns were raised about charges for storage and lack of clarity on charges for storage, lack of clarity on license requirements and fees, particularly where storage is co-located with generation, and the treatment of storage in industry codes, and particularly whether all of those requirements are appropriate for storage. An issue was also raised around pre-2014 small-scale generation, which exceeded a certain threshold, meaning it wasn't eligible for a certain storage fast-track process. And finally, there's an issue around NIE Networks not having adopted the latest security of supply standard, which takes more account of storage in certain calculations. Moving on to information transparency and commercial arrangements, there is currently no information on storage connections on the NIE Networks website. People also told us, and this is certainly something we can sympathise with, it's very challenging to keep up with the pace of policy changes in this area. There are lots of moving parts. And finally, there's no established mechanism at present for procuring storage services, apart from noting the Flex trials that Cormac has talked about. And some of the barriers that came out to storage around the grid connection process, some concerns around offer of terms for connection expiring before planning approval is obtained. And I think this is a particular issue for storage where it's a relatively new technology and there can be more challenges in the planning process for, I suppose, things that are less well understood. We've already touched on the limited network capacity for export connections in certain parts of the network. A number of people raised concerns about the over-install limit, which is currently 20%, being a particular hindrance where storage is co-located with generation. And something that was picked up from the internal survey from NIE Networks' point of view, very understandably, they have separate connection policies for generation and demand connections, which has historically made sense, but don't necessarily have the same policy documents for storage. So, as we've mentioned, some of the barriers we've identified are being taken up by other departments or groups of people. So for example, the NIE FLEX project, which Cormac has been talking about, addresses some of the issues identified in the FESS project. Issues around procurement documents for flexibility services, indicating the location and details of network constraints, and making that more transparent, and considering requirements for contracts for flexibility services and issues around that. There's also a group I mentioned called the Flex Tech Industry Forum, which is a joint body, I think that's between NIE Networks, Sony, AirGrid, and ESB Networks. And again, they have a program of work which looks at some of the issues that were identified. So their activities include providing clarity for storage requirements in industry codes and reviewing the 20% over-install limit, which was raised as a concern. And finally, there's a number of things which sit under the activities of other government departments. So things around legislation and licenses. The utility regulator embarked on a process of tariff review earlier this year, providing clarity on the interaction of storage with other policies, so things to do with the planning process. That's how these activities and issues are being taken forwards. So that's the story from where we started to the barriers piece and funneling down to our FESS activity. So in this next bit, I'm going to summarize the development of solutions from the FESS project, including the preparation of consultation documents and project dissemination. So as we've mentioned, the solutions to the barriers identified fell in the remit of different projects and activities within NIE Networks. So only barriers that weren't being addressed elsewhere were considered in detail as part of the FESS project. We didn't want to duplicate effort. So the list of activities for the FESS program of work included looking at the availability of information for storage, stakeholder engagement, additional guidance during the application process, reviewing network use of system charges for storage, a small piece around queue prioritization, a review of internal connection processes for storage, and some small operational matters. So once we had in mind what the FESS program of work was going to be, one of the activities was to consult on that, which Josh has already mentioned. So we ran a consultation this summer outlining the FESS program of work, and we had 13 responses from a variety of stakeholders, including storage developers and operators, associations, demand side units, and aggregators. In general, the responses to the consultation were in favour of the FESS program of work. Or in some cases, there were some additional items to consider around some of the details of these. But the feedback we received was that many respondents supported the direction of travel and were appreciative of the opportunity to engage. As well as the consultation responses, providing feedback of general support for the FESS program, some additional concerns were highlighted. So we just wanted to talk about the themes we heard from the FESS consultation and how those are being taken forwards. So the top two items here, the need for contracts to allow revenue stacking for storage operators and the need for clear and transparent commercial arrangements for flexibility services, these are being considered as part of the FLEX project. And then also transparency from NIE Networks on the location of network constraints and planned future work. That was raised by a number of respondents, and we recognise that's an important and big issue. Certainly, we considered this was a larger issue than the FESS project could cover, both in terms of the FESS timescale, but also that this was wider than a storage issue. And this will be picked up by other groups within NIE Networks. People also raised some good feedback about where we had talked in the use cases about storage support, providing flexibility services associated with a specific generation connection. People raised the issue of NIE Networks perhaps having a strategic, identifying strategic areas that needed support rather than linking storage services to a specific generation project. And that's what Cormac was talking about with the identification of these geographic zones. People really stressed in the consultation response the importance of clarifying use of system charges for storage. The over-install limit came up again in the responses, and there was in general strong support for stakeholder engagement events and input. So just to talk about what we've been doing mostly this year, the FESS project has, as I mentioned, there's currently no dedicated page for storage on NIE's website. So we did a review of what DNOs, typically in GB and Ireland, provide, what sort of information they provide on their websites, and looked at best practice. And based on these, we have proposed some alterations to the Connections webpage, which includes a dedicated storage page, signposting stakeholders to relevant forms and documents for storage projects. Also to help stakeholder engagement with NIE connections leading up to the application, we have drafted a storage guide for customers, so a document aimed at customers, which includes, again, pointers to relevant application forms, but also a bit of a discussion around the impact of storage on the distribution network, what the role of NIE Networks is here, and a Q&A section at the end. In terms of network charges for storage, distribution use of system charges, NIE Networks is conducting an internal review on tariff reform, and the FESS project has been liaising with relevant staff to consider appropriate options for duos charges for storage. The FESS project produced a briefing note on use of system charges for storage, which included an international review of how storage is charged in other jurisdictions, and a number of options for charges. So that will support NIE Networks to propose an interim approach to network charges for storage. And this is in the context, we say interim approach because there are wider reviews taking place at the moment, being led by the utility regulator. And on stakeholder engagement, the FESS project has engaged with stakeholders in a number of ways. We've mentioned including the market survey, the consultation event, the consultation of paper, and this close down event. So I'd like to echo something Josh said earlier, which is to thank people for their input to the project. Looking at some of the internal issues and barriers that were raised, as I mentioned, NIE Networks has got an internal policy documents for looking separately at generation and demand connections. And while most of this is relevant for storage, it was felt that there are some storage specific issues that would be helpful to clarify. So the FESS project has drafted a storage connection policy document, which is an internal document for the NIE Networks connections team. Looking at some operational matters, we've had a number of meetings with different system owners within NIE Networks. So people who own and use the modeling software and databases, just to raise the issue of storage connections with them and try and understand the readiness of their systems to accept and handle storage connections. So I think that's been a very useful exercise. And finally, we've done a little bit of work looking at this possibility of flexibility providers being promoted in a connection queue. That's an idea that came from the Open Networks project from the NIE Networks Association. In the consultation, you told us that you wanted NIE to explore that further. So that's something that Josh will be taking forwards, just sort of exploring the idea. So finally, some of the barriers that are addressed by other NIE Networks activities, we also summarize these in the consultation paper. So the issue around pre-2014 microgeneration, which we talked about, the NIE Networks Association is reviewing fast track modifications in GB, which could address this issue. So NIE Networks will remain in touch with the developments of that work. Looking at network constraints, which we've talked about, there's various activities in this area within NIE Networks, including a review of the cluster substation methodology, development of non-firm offers, and development of two-tier maximum import capacity connections. Looking at the security of supply standard, NIE is following an ENA working group on this, which they're currently finalizing changes to the latest version of this standard, P28, and the ENA will then consult, and subsequently NIE Networks will consult on that and consider adopting that standard. And there was a suggestion at some point from some of the stakeholder feedback in the project that storage solutions could be suggested when a generation application is rejected. Just to come back to something that I think Cormac mentioned, that NIE Networks is technology agnostic. So the preferred route there is to point customers towards other options, such as zero export or limited export connections. So just to summarize, we started off with a review of storage in general. So looking at different storage technologies, examples of international projects, the global deployment of storage, and general regulatory issues around storage. We then focused in on NIE Networks specifically, so seeking to understand the constraints that NIE Networks are facing and how storage could support these with the development of our use cases. We identified barriers to storage connections, again, specifically in Northern Ireland and connecting to NIE Networks, drawing on a number of sources, and then went through a process of assessing and triaging those barriers to formulate the FESS programme of work. And this year we've been delivering the FESS programme of work with key activities being drafting the web page, the customer guide, the review of network charges activity, and the internal policy document, as well as a number of other smaller activities. So that is our whistle-stop tour of the FESS programme of work. I'll just pass back to Josh to talk about what the next steps are for NIE Networks before we open the floor to questions and discussions.
Great, Claire, thanks very much for that. Yeah, so just a concluding slide then really on the next steps for NIE Networks, as I think, as I said at the start of this presentation, while the FESS project is concluding, and I suppose this event doesn't mark the firm conclusion of the project. It will continue for another few weeks, but it will be concluding soon, and some activities will either be delivered by the team in the coming weeks, or else be delivered by relevant teams in NIE Networks outside of the FESS remit. The first two, I suppose, and take these two together, the website modifications and the customer storage guide. So really the next step on them is just a final review, and very soon you'll see them being published on the NIE Networks website. The distribution usage system charges for storage. The project learnings have been passed on to the relevant team to incorporate this into their own internal review, and that's something that we will continue to engage with, a team we're pretty engaged with on that subject. Flexibility and connection queues. So something that has been investigated throughout the FESS project, something which we detailed in the FESS consultation, and we receive good and positive feedback from yourselves in that consultation, and that project learning will be packaged up, so to speak, and passed on to the relevant team to investigate and investigate further. Finally, then the storage connection policy. This has been developed over recent months and weeks, and a lot of work has went into the development of this policy, and will continue to be developed. It's in the coming months, hoping that this will be issued potentially at the start of 2022, all being well. So look, that's just I want to provide that overview of the next steps to show that while the project may be concluding in the recent weeks, that there will be aspects of the project that will be continuing on. Just going to hand over to Andrew now to take us through this.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks Claire, and thanks Josh for running us all through that. And yeah, hopefully you can see there's a considerable amount of sort of effort has gone into this project, and hopefully you guys will start to see the outcomes in terms of facilitating connections and things like that there. So like if anyone wants to pop any questions into the chat at this stage, please feel free to do so, or even if you want to raise your hand, and like I can come to you to ask that question. I don't think we've had any questions throughout the presentation. I think that speaks well for Claire's presentation. We've covered off all the relevant areas. Or even if anybody wants to give any feedback on their experiences in connecting batteries or utilizing batteries in NI, or even on experiences further afield, if anyone wants to comment. Yeah, I'll come to Bobby Smith then, please. If you just say where you're from as well, if you're asking a question.
Yep, sure. Thanks, Andrew. It's Bobby Smith from Energy Storage Ireland here. Thanks. It's a really good presentation, a lot of detail in it, and appreciate the kind of engagement throughout the development of the program. My question is really just, maybe I missed it, maybe it was covered, but in terms of the contracts that were offered under the trial, do you have a figure for how many of those, or how much of that capacity was storage?
Yeah, I'll let Cormac take that one.
Yes. Hi, Bobby. So, look, a very small proportion. It was a group of domestic batteries, which is providing less than 100 kilowatts out of our 20 megawatts. So, but obviously, we'd hope to see that grow in the future. The one thing I would say in the contracts is that, look, it was they were pushed out in quite a tight time scale, the tender, and obviously with a trial, these are really simulated constraints, so we didn't expect any participant in the market to be building new assets in response to this, whereas in the future, we'd hope to give, first of all, much more notice as part of kind of enhanced reporting on our network and where the constraints are going to materialize, then to tender much further in advance, and then to provide also a much longer duration in contracts. It'll be interesting to get, if you have any kind of initial thoughts on those kind of timelines, how far in advance should we be, or do you need to be signposting needs, then tendering, and then how long do you think the contracts should be?
Yeah, it's a good question. Something we're going through ourselves at the moment, because the EirGrid and Sony are developing the future system services arrangements, and
that's right.
You'd expect that in future, with some distribution connected batteries, would be able to stack the revenues and provide both services to NIE Networks and then also up to Sony as well. And what we're trying to stress with the system operators, that you need quite a lot of clear forecasting of service needs in the future, and also locational services as well for developers to have sight of when and where to connect and what the potential revenue opportunities might be. So as much certainty in advance is good. And the second part of the question is, I suppose, yeah, the longer term contracts are certainly helpful for delivering new investment. There will be quite a lot of battery storage on the system over the next 6 to 12 months. Maybe some of that's connected at the distribution level. I probably have to check my own records there in the north, but those projects certainly take advantage of maybe near term revenue streams. But to deliver kind of new investment, yes, certainly that kind of longer term contracting certainly is beneficial.
There is, I suppose, to follow up on that. Obviously, or where we are at the moment, our primary objective is in terms of investment deferral. So obviously, you can understand from our perspective, we would need a reasonable degree of certainty as well. And yeah, we'd also like to, within reason, lock in a price that represents a cost-effective alternative to the investment. But that's not to preclude us from exploring potentially closer to real-time procurement options in the future, as mentioned during that piece. And then obviously there's an element of what legislation is pushing or indeed mandating in that space as well. But certainly, the other thing is that we would see, obviously, as low carbon technologies come onto the network, they will be a lot of the cause of congestion, but now they can be part of the solution. That's domestic storage and potentially particularly EVs, and really unlocking that flexibility where obviously the primary capital cost is amortized in their primary function, getting people from A to B and so on, or minimizing the spill from solar PV. The other thing as well is, we can observe that we have benefited from the DS3 tariff rates to date, where a lot of the investment in control functionality and monitoring and so on has already been made, and participants particularly in demand side aggregation are then quite quickly able to transfer that over to ourselves. So like we have, that's one of the key benefits of being able to stack revenues, but also I suppose been slightly following on from that revenue stream.
Just a question out as well, if you don't mind. Would any battery connected to distribution level be able to participate in these future services? Does it have to be a particular threshold?
It's a case of location.
Yeah, of course.
The TSO obviously views the system within reason as a whole, whereas the distribution network is typically designed in a trickle down nature. So, if we have a constraint at a given bulk supply point or primary substation, the customers downstream from that are the cause, but then they're also can only be the solution. So that's a practical challenge that we face, and obviously as we move further down into the network, the pool of potential providers becomes smaller and smaller and smaller.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Thanks, Bobby. There's a question in there from Mike around grid access and certainty for grid access around accessing different types of DS3 or flex. And I suppose like I can maybe start on this. We have explored or started to explore under this project the concept of if you're connecting a battery which is going to provide benefit or services to the network, then is there a means by which we can expedite that and that kind of thing. And that's kind of where the key prioritization thing kind of comes in. And there's obviously complexities around that in terms of our connections process and that kind of thing. But and we have to manage obviously the way we design our batteries connections to the system is that the connection design has to be fit for the import to charge the battery, but also the export if the battery is exporting to the system. And we have to cover off all those criteria. But if there's capacity, then that's no issue. If there's limited capacity, then there may be connection charges or something. But like that's one of the things that we'll look to explore in future about how we can streamline that or make that things like flexible or managed connections going forward.
Yeah, I've not got much to add to what you said there, Andrew. Other than agree that the FESS has looked at that and identified the complexities as you referenced, and we referenced the flexibility and connection queues to findings to be packaged up and passed on, and in a similar extent it will be similar with that, where the findings and those complexities we found will be packaged up and passed on to the relevant teams.
I think just to add to that, Josh, this idea of the flexibility and connection queues, as I mentioned, that came from the Open Networks project in GB. So as we understand it, DNOs in GB are allowed to consider prioritizing people in the connection queue if they can guarantee they will release capacity, connect other people in the queue. But that exists in theory, but we don't know that anyone's tried it in practice. As Josh has said, there's quite a lot of complexities. So at the moment, there's sort of a couple of paragraphs in a queue management document that says, oh yes, you're allowed to do this, but we don't know that anyone's tried it yet. So I think there's probably a way to go on some of those ideas, but just to let you know that, yeah, people are starting to think about these and explore them.
Thanks, folks. Just give maybe another minute if there's any final questions there. Yeah, there's a follow up there just on that last question around instruction sets and how those would apply to batteries, and I suppose like just for the wider benefit, like we do have for any flexibility providers that are participating in third-party markets which are outside our control, we have an instruction set process to ensure that when they're dispatched by a third party such as the TSO, that they're not causing issues on the distribution network. And that's an existing process, and our plan would be to evolve that into a more dynamic kind of process. And yeah, like that would apply equally to batteries or demand response or generators or whatever that might be in unconstrained areas of the network. But the idea of evolving those on our side is that we would take a more real-time approach to that and be able to give more dynamic, and the idea of giving more dynamic access, that we should be able to give greater access because we're basing that on real-time load flows and real-time weather forecasts and things like that. Okay, we'll maybe wrap it up with that then, folks. And look, if there's any further specific queries, like happy to follow up by email or to arrange calls on any specific issues with folks if that would be helpful. But yeah, hopefully the work that we've done here will benefit those of you who are looking to connect now, but also this is an emerging area. Someone mentioned like EVs and vehicle to grid and that kind of thing. As that emerges more over the next few years, the work we've done here will hopefully facilitate the connection of those to the network, and then there's mutual benefits. There's benefits to those of you who are connecting to the network, and yeah, there's benefits to the distribution and the wider energy system there as well. Yeah, just thanks to everyone for your input to date on the project. Thanks to Josh, Cormac and Claire for presenting today. We'll close the session there. Thanks very much.
Thanks all.
Thank you, Andrew. Just to note as well, we will be writing a FESS close down report. Well, we are writing one, and that